Thank you. I'm glad you all could make it here today. Uh, Hi, I'm the wrong hero. This presentation is called Naked to My Enemies. And by the way, you are tuned to Cafe Cabaret. Please ignore all those television cameras in the background. Uh, it's just a part of my project to design to glorify me by encapsulating every performance I've ever done to the 99.9th percentile, um, so that in the future, a race of almond-eyed, pointy-headed aliens can gibber incomprehensibly over the works of my genius. In any event, this is part 5 of our series on politics, and we were specifically focusing upon the 1996 election, and thankfully, this will probably be the last segment of our projected 15-week series on politics that deals specifically with the 1996 election, although we'll probably be referring to it from time to time in much the same way that a good doctor must refer to heart disease and cancer from time to time when speaking of holistic medicine. Yeah, well, that Andrew Weil, he's got on the cover of what, Time magazine. Geez, the same guy that wrote From Chocolate to Morphine, the same guy who was really gung-ho about legalizing marijuana, and now he's on the cover of Time. Times are changing. I don't know what else to say. Of course, Time comes across with its usual jittery. We're not quite sure we approve of this person, but since so many people like him, I guess we got to pretend to at least. And then they say, oh, whenever they talk about homeopathic medicine, it's always the same old tired cliches they trot out. The medical academy disapproves because the methodology isn't there. It may not help, but it couldn't hurt, and it might actually help. The placebo effect, always the same old crappy cliches. Why doesn't somebody come up with some new cliches? But then I guess they wouldn't be cliches now, would they? You might have noticed I've drunk about maybe a half a gallon of coffee. Somehow I think that if I speak faster, time will go faster. But that's not the case. And hey, what about that Bob Dole? Ha! Yeah, he's doing a lot better for himself now than he would have been if he had actually beaten Clinton. Because bad things tend to happen to Clinton's enemies, and worse things tend to happen to Clinton's friends. So, just be advised of that. Yeah, okay. Everybody was saying, oh, what's poor Bob going to do? What's poor Bob Dole going to do if he loses? He's not in the Senate anymore. Oh, he probably has a busier social calendar now than he did when he was sort of coasting along in the Senate. But the big question is, what is Bill going to do? Chelsea will be getting out of just about in her senior year at college unless she goes through Stanford in 3 years. And maybe Bill will go back to school. I wouldn't be at all surprised if instead of doing the Senate route that John Quincy Adams did, or the House of Representatives, which would be kind of a come down, where do you go after you're president? The mayoralty of a large city? I don't think so. It would be like Ronald Reagan deciding to become the mayor of Anaheim after having been president. It's probably a job he could have handled, actually. But anyway, gee, what is Clinton going to do? I know. He'll take the Eisenhower route. What do you do after you've won World War II single-handedly? Why, you become the president of Columbia University, which is what Ike did, and then he became president of the United States. And Wilson was like the head of Princeton, and then he became president of the United States. So maybe Bill's strategy will be, let's see, I'll become president of Stanford, and then when they've forgotten that I was ever president, I'll run for president again and win. And, geez, it's too bad. Too bad about that 3-term limit, but it did save us from some pretty disastrous presidents. That's for sure. Well, like I said last week, Eisenhower wouldn't have lasted through a 3rd term, and we would have had Nixon at least 4 years early. And let's see. Well, had Johnson had heart problems. That's one reason he decided not to run again in '68, although he was perfectly within his rights to do so. Well, Nixon wouldn't have made it into he didn't even make it past his second term. Ford was defeated for re-election. Carter was defeated for re-election, so it's moot. Reagan would not have been very wise to run for president for a third term, but he might have, just to show that Frankie Roosevelt what's what. Hell, he might have even decided to run for a fourth term. And it would be just about this time that he would decide he didn't want to be president anymore. And that youngster Bob Dole would be president under Reagan, since Reagan would have ditched Bush after 2 VP terms. We would have never had Dan Quayle if Ronald Reagan had run for a third and then, yes, a fourth term. Perhaps he could have even taken it to an unprecedented 5th term. So beloved was he. But these are mere idle speculations. Anyway, sorry I'm so sleepy. I don't know. I got plenty of rest. I went to bed. I don't know. Well, I snapped at my girlfriend at 10:30. Spent an hour consoling her. Finally fell asleep maybe around midnight. Got up bright and early at 6:30 and fucked, and then took the dog out, and then went back to bed at 7 or so, and then I woke up at 10, and I thought, oh, I'll just rest my eyes for another minute, and ended up sleeping another half hour. Then I got up, made myself breakfast. You'll be happy to know that my breakfast, for those of you who hate me, was an artery-clogging 3 eggs, plus, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 spoonfuls of refried beans with lime and green chilies, which weren't as good, I think, as the ones with jalapenos would have been. It's the Ortega brand. They're kind of bland. I mean, you know, they're salty, but they're not salty, and they're beany, but they're not beany. It's hard to explain exactly. Like if you'd made them yourself, they'd have been much better, but it would have taken about 50 times longer. The dog started jerking when he heard this, say longer, and maybe he thought I was going to take her out to the park. Some cheese whiz and bread. That was my breakfast. And of course, enormous cups of extremely strong coffee. But now the effects are beginning to wear off. It's like Dr. Caffeine and Mr. Decaf or whatever. No, Dr. Decaf and Mr. Caffeine. That's me. It's like, where's my coffee? I'm gonna be pretty damn mad if I don't find my coffee. Oh, here it is. That's much better. Now those wipe out. So now all those endorphins are permitted to flow freely across their borders. They're not being restricted by the MAO inhibitors from flooding my brain with this blissful feeling. The dog is trembling and shaking its head. Why do you want to get up here on the couch? Just because I'm here? No, what are you doing? What? All right. Get up on the couch. I know you can't bear to be far from me. So, you know, I don't get good ideas like this very often, so I have to write them down when I do. So anyway, Henrik Hertzberg, in the New Yorker for the 11th of November, gave his version of the, I guess it was his template for a concession speech. Manful, number 1, manful, rueful acknowledgement of the pain of defeat. Of course, Lincoln did something like that. He said, I sort of felt when I lost my first congressional election like the little boy who was too big to cry but too small to ignore the pain. Anyway, a message of congratulations to the victor. Well, I'd like to thank my distinguished opponent, even though he fucks dogs' dicks, and I hope that he doesn't lead the country into irreparable ruin, but that he continues to follow in the great tradition of leaders like I would have been if I had been elected President of the United States. Thank you very much, and God bless America, because she's going to need all your prayers in the years to come due to the victory of my opponent, who is totally irresponsible and has not the slightest clue of how to run things, and hardly has the best interests of the country at heart, but rather only the best interests of himself and his hand-picked political cronies from that terrible little dipshit state he comes from, where the hillbillies have 3 teeth on the uppers and 2 teeth on the lowers, and I think I'm going to play that number when I get home, and yeah, it's terrible, a terrible day for America, but so God bless America, and please give her all your prayers, and you Catholics, go and light a candle and pray to the Virgin, and you Jews, do whatever it is you do with those mezuzahs or wazuzus or whatever, and you Episcopalians, well, you just stay out of my way, because I don't want to have to deal with you right now. You all have horsey teeth, and you worship the King of England, and I don't need that. And I don't know, God bless America. And number 3, part of the concession speech, pledge to close ranks behind the people's choice. Well, yeah, well, you know, we only got one president, and he's unfortunately totally unqualified to run this country, except straight into the ground, but nevertheless, I guess you're going to have to make do with what you got, because, you know, after all, the American people get the president they deserve, and by God, what are you people, what were you thinking? Good God, my medicine, jacket pocket, can't reach it, water, that's better. Well, yes, you Americans, where was I? Thank you to my wife, children, supporters, my trusts, my braces, my whatever, I just think I just swallowed a fire ant. That was number 4. Number 5 was praise for the political system. It's a great country when you can vote for any idiot and see him get elected, and there isn't the military to come and tell you, no, you can't do that, although I've been talking to some of the people at Joint Chiefs of Staffs, and if our man drops the ball one more time, we just might have to straighten him out a little bit, forget you ever heard that. I spoke out of turn. Anyway, it's a great country where you can elect an utter incompetent who doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together on his own, never had a job in his life, never did a day's hard work, never did a single lick of hard work in all his born days, unless you count going to Yale Law School, which, well, you know, what I say about law school. The first year they scare you to death, the second year they work you to death, and the third year they bore you to death. And well, so we went to law school. So what? That doesn't mean anything. My little chickadee. Yes. You gotta love a man who hates dogs and children. Any man who hates dogs and children can't be all bad. Yes. Well, praise be to speckled things, as Gerard Manley Hopkins said. Praise be to dappled things, or praise be to do-dapple-do-da-day things there. The nitty-gritty ditty dirt band. That's a joke there. That's what George Bush said. So, yes, it's a great political system when less than half the voters lowest turnout since 1824 can elect a man who's so eminently unqualified to be president that I wouldn't even let him shine my shoes. He'd probably leave dirt on the wingtips there and steal the pennies out of the penny loafers and yes, he'd probably pour water on the steel-toed boots and rust them and yeah, whatever it is he'd do. He'd probably try to shine the bottoms and wipe off the tops with turpentine or to get rid of the dirt. I don't know. Whatever. Did he ever shine a shoe in his life? That's what I want to know. I don't think so. Down in Arkansas, you know, they had plenty of people doing that, and none of them were Bill's friends. No. Did I say Bill? I meant my distinguished opponent, whoever he is. Speaking in the abstract, it's a great political system when you can have, where was I? You can have someone who, like, in the great days of political oratory, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this man wouldn't even have been fit to turn on FDR's microphone, and now he's on television saying this and that and the other thing, and, well, Bob Dole doesn't believe in television. Bob Dole believes in radio. That's the kind of candidate Bob Dole is, and if Bob Dole were president, Bob Dole wouldn't appear on television. Bob Dole would give the message straight to the American people by telling it to reporters first, and maybe lashing out at them angrily when they refuse to print exactly what I tell them to. What's wrong with you people anyway? Why do you watch so much television? Back in my day, we didn't have television. We didn't even have radio. We were cavemen. We lived in caves. Our food came in woolly mammoths. We'd split them open and eat what was in there. And we'd stampede a herd off the side of a cliff. That was our idea of a political potlatch picnic. And yes, I was saying to Noah the other day, yes, back when I was a kid, me and Noah, and the 12 apostles, and Jesus, we were barbecuing Judas over a spit, and, well, Pilate spit in Jesus' face, and where was I? Oh, yes, me and my old buddy W.C. Fields, yes. Number 6. Assertion that what unites us is more important than what divides us. Well, as the song says, united we stand, united we fall, or something like that. Oh, that's Ross Perot. I don't want to be seen doing Ross Perot's jokes. That was a joke, too. World's biggest joke. Why didn't Ross Perot get out of there? Why did he have to stay in there? What was wrong with him? He had no chance of winning. He's just ruining it for everybody else. He's just like a dog in a manger, a dog in a manger, a dog in a manger. You know what a dog in a manger is, don't you? Well, a dog in a manger is when you get a dog and he's sitting on some hay and the cow wants to eat it and the dog says no. And the cow says, you can't eat it, why don't you give it to me? And the dog says, if I can't have it, nobody can. That's Ross Perot for you. Yeah, he's the kind of kid, he'd cut ahead of you in line. He's a diabetic, he can't even eat half the stuff, but he'd cut ahead of you in line anyway, just to spite you, because he can't eat it, so why should you have fun? Enjoy it. Ice cream. I like ice cream. Bob Dole likes ice cream. If you have any ice cream treats for me, I'll get off the stage. No? Okay, I'll keep going. Well, yeah, so what unites us is more important than what divides us. But speaking of uniting with some from young and tender little, yeah, what about those Kennedys? Making it with the babysitter. What unites them is much more important than what divides them, I'll tell you that. Yeah, pretty slick, that Bill Clinton, man, taking that Governor Weld, shipping him off to Mexico. Well, maybe where's he going to ship me off to? Mongolia? I don't know. Don't ask Bob Dole these questions. He's not equipped to answer them at this time. If I had an ambassadorship, I think I'd like to be ambassador to Chicago, yes. Great city, the windy, yes. Al Capone, gangsters, Prohibition, Elliot Ness, J. Edgar Hoover, Cicero, not the Greek orator, not Porky Pig's nephew, but the suburb of Chicago. That's what I'd like to do. I'd like to live in Cicero and be the ambassador to Chicago, and every now and then run a bunch of whiskey from Winnipeg into Chi, and yes, wear three-piece suits and hats with stripes in the bands and little feathers and whatnot. Where's my hat? That's become, there's, don't, the rest of my speech is in it. So, I'll say it one more time because I'm beginning to bore even myself. What unites us is more important than what divides us. And that's all I have to say on that. Number 7. Pledge to carry on the cause to which the campaign was allegedly devoted. Well, I'm 73 years old. I'm not really going to be around much longer. Maybe another 20 years, tops. Maybe 30. I don't know. With recent advances in medical science, maybe they'll make a clone. And I can put my brain in a new clone body, and I'd be around for the next 100 years, and I can make 30 more runs for the presidency. And that would be pretty good, because, you know, Bob Dole doesn't just lie down. Bob Dole learns from every mistake he makes. And if I had the thing to run again, if it were me and Gore, I'd kill that little Tennessee twerp. His father was he didn't accomplish anything. And Al Gore, he's no better. He's his father's son. The apple never falls far from the tree. And so, my brain, my thinking, it's still sharp. Save my brain. I don't want you cutting my brain up when I die. No, save my brain, put it in the clone, send the clone to Washington. He can stay asleep for 23 hours. He'll have that stamina. They'll clone it. It'll be like a 23-year-old body and a 90-year-old brain. Yes. And clone the brain, too, for that matter. Because, after all, you know, two's better than one. Two heads are better than one. That's what they say. And clone it twice. Make 1,000 brains, 1,000 clones. Bob Dole. Run for every seat in Congress. And let's see. Let me do the math here. 100 senatorial seats. 465. What is it? How many congressmen are there? I forget, but something like that. Okay, 600 and their staff. 1,000 Bob Doles run the legislative branch. Who would be better? Is there anybody who would be better? They'd never argue. They'd all be Bob Dole. Bob Dole is not a divided mind. A divided mind cannot stand against itself. The great Abraham Lincoln said that, or something like it. So, with these 1,000 Bob Doles, I pledge to carry on the theme of the campaign, which I was supposed to have decided what it was long before Election Day, but didn't. And that's one reason why I was unable to defeat Bill Clinton. But then, Bill Clinton, he always copies the Republicans, sometimes before we even think of the things. So he'll have 1,000 clones. And 1,000 Bob Dole clones, age 23, will be fighting 1,000 Bill Clinton clones, age 23. Who do you think would win? Pudgy or the man who fought in World War II and sacrificed his right arm for his country? You can't ask for more than that. People say I'd give my right arm for that. I gave my right arm for that. And don't you forget it. And I would clobber that puny little Arkansas frat boy, and every one of my clones would stomp all over him. Well, maybe one of the clones will be sick that day, but it'll be Bob Dole, 999. Bill Clinton, 1. Never let it be said that I'm totally unfair and biased. I did say that one of the Bill Clinton clones probably would win. I mean, the odds against all of my clones beating all of his clones are pretty slender. But I'd say I'm 999 times the man he is. 999 of my clones could beat 1,000 of his clones, because one of them would run away. They'd all run away. One of my clones could beat all of his clones. They'd all run away. But no, and that would be my way of carrying on the cause to which I, Bob Dole, am devoted. So, in conclusion then, no wait, there's more. Well, I'd like to say, I'd like to end on a note of gracious ruefulness. Quote from Abraham Lincoln. I was supposed to have prepared such a quote, or at least my staff was supposed to have prepared such a quote, but let me think. 87 years ago, as the great Abraham Lincoln said. Let's see, what is that? 87 years ago. That's about as old as I am. Bob Dole was born in a log cabin in Russell, Kansas, and If you give me a minute, I could probably think of, there's my friend Jimmy Stewart. Bob, what you doing, Bob? You've got to be kidding, Bob. You quote, just, no, cut it out, Bob. Oh yeah, where was I got this spit. It's in the bottom of my jaw. It's accumulating there. I didn't want to swallow it because I thought maybe I'd retch it. Phew, yeah. Anyway, never let it be said that Bob Dole spit on the Well, that was the Constitution I spit on. Well, let's see. Oh yeah, Abraham Lincoln. Well, what did Lincoln say? I'm sure he said a lot of things. Well, he said, a nation divided against itself. He said, oh, I don't know, let's piss on the fire and call in the dogs. He said, log cabin syrup. He said, if I could free all the slaves, I'd do it, and if I couldn't free them all, I wouldn't do it. And just so long as the Union was preserved. And let's see. Well, yes, it's pretty hard to come up with a Lincoln quote right off the top of your head, but anyway, as the great Abraham Lincoln would have said if he were in my position, good luck, God bless America, thank you all, and goodbye. This has been my confession speech, and so now I'm going to turn into, I'm going to go to bed now. Thank you. God bless you. God bless me. Who's on tight? So, anyway, I hope you found that impromptu bit of whimsy, which went for 22 minutes, amusing. No, it was actually 17 minutes. Wow, 17 minutes. Well, anyway, so that's a sample of what Bob Dole's concession speech might have been. As Michael Kelly said, also in the special post-mortem edition of the New Yorker, every losing presidential race has its forlorn hope. And as we know, in 1988 it was, well, Governor Dukakis can't possibly win enough of the popular vote to win, but maybe, just maybe, if he concentrates on some of the prime presidential real estate of the Democrats in years past, he just might squeak by with a narrow plurality in the Electoral College. Alas, 'twas not to be, but if you look at an electoral map, Dukakis did much better against Bush than any presidential candidate since Carter, and he sort of laid the groundwork. So every state that Dukakis won, I believe virtually every one of those states was a state that Clinton also won in 1992. So Clinton sort of built his victory on the back of Michael Dukakis' last-minute surge. So, as Scott Reed put it concerning the Republican race, every time we turn around, boom, we're knocked on our ass. So, again, quoted by Michael Kelly. Michael Kelly also quotes, politicians are gamblers, and while they believe devoutly in the odds, they also believe in the 1,000,000-to-1 shot coming home. Well, Bob Dole was, in fact, not quite a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, but he did not come home anyway. He speaks at length about Bob Dole. Dole always ran in a state of agitation against what he was doing every day, as if he were determined to have an opponent worthy of himself. A successful candidate is like a donkey on a treadmill. He does what he is supposed to do when he is supposed to do it. He masters the essential arguments of his side. He stays on message. He works 16 hours a day. He obeys the advice of his aides. Nobody has ever taken political direction better than Clinton. He governs by it. Dole never took direction at all. He never learned to accept the standard relationship between the candidate and his manager, defendant, lawyer. Never mastered the sloganeering of his side, let alone the core intellectual arguments. Take me on trust or don't take me at all, was the message of Bob Dole. He abandoned any sense of formal structure. He spoke in phrases and fragments that interrupted one another at his whim, like a call waiting system gone awry, non sequitur giving way to non sequitur. Sometimes he seemed lost in his utterances, wandering through the boneyard of his mind, picking up an idea here, waving it for a moment, dropping it for another, a few feet away. When he lit upon a word or phrase that struck him as especially important, he would yell it out 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a row. But then, in the same speech, and sometimes in the same paragraph, he would slide suddenly into the groove, into a funny, evocative riff. In its last few days, the campaign achieved a sort of Dolean purity, a state of perfect, antic formlessness. Once again, quoting from Michael Kelly for one more time, effective cynicism will mow down renegade perversity every time. Speaking, of course, of Bob Dole. Bob Dole. You know, the more I read about Bob Dole, the more I get into his head, the more I like him. I wasn't very too fond of Bob Dole back in 1976 when he was Gerald Ford's running mate. I would have voted for Carter anyway, but Bob Dole is one of the reasons I didn't vote for Ford. I didn't realize at the time that he was one of the reasons to vote for Ford. Just think, if Ford had won, and there was a very narrow margin of victory, I don't think there would have been the kind of permissive drug culture which ruled the late 70s, but who knows? Maybe the drug culture would have been even more permissive. What if Jimmy Carter hadn't won? Maybe we would have been spared disco. We would have had more Philadelphia soul instead. Elton John would have continued his record-breaking run up the charts. Elton John and Bernie Taupin would have been the Lennon-McCartney of the 70s instead of, well, the Elton John and Bernie Taupin of the 70s. And so if Ford had been president, instead of Carter, he could have even run for another term in 1980. He only took over 2 years of Nixon's term. Let's see, it was August, September, October, November. No, I guess he would have been only eligible to serve one more term. Let me think. 3 months, 75. Yeah, he only served 2 years and 3 months, but that was enough to put the kibosh. Now, if Nixon had resigned in November of 1994, of course, I guess Ford could have run for a 3rd term and then resigned and let his vice president run things for those lousy 3 months that he would have been going over his mandate. Anyway, at the very least, Bob Dole would have been admirably situated to run for president in 1980, having had been vice president for 4 years. Now remember, Nelson Rockefeller was a sickly man. It's really odd, almost bizarre, that Gerald Ford selected Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. For a brief 2 years and 3 months, we had the only president and vice president in our history who were not elected by the people of the United States. Isn't that something odd? Of course, you know, Bill Clinton only got 49% of the vote of 48% of the people, which means he basically was elected by a mandate of 24% of eligible voters. That is so cool, man. But still, it's better than he did back in '92 when he was elected by, I believe it was 43% of 49% of eligible voters. So, in other words, at that point, he was elected with 21.2% of the votes of the American people. Now, contrast this to Lincoln, who I believe was elected by 39% of 80% of eligible voters, which meant that he got 4/5 of 40%, which is 32%. 32% of the people of the United States voted for Abraham Lincoln. So, historically speaking, he got one of the larger votes in American history. Now, when we consider that the presidents are elected by such a relative minority of the population, unlike in Australia where everyone is required to vote, and if they don't, then they get taxed. When we consider this, then we should probably open up our political system a little bit, let third and fourth parties run for office, and let simple majorities decide who is to be president, or for that matter, senator, congressman. You know, the political parties are beginning to look more and more alike. If we don't let the third party influence have more influence on our polity, then we are going to begin to resemble the type of monolithic state that the Soviet Union was so deplored for resembling. I'm just trying to do a little bit of basic math in my head here. The only other candidate who even came close to the kind of plurality that someone like Lincoln had back in the days when more people went to the polls than currently do is, someone like Lyndon Johnson, who in 1964 finally vindicated his 1952 nickname, Landslide Lyndon. Let's see, he got 62% of the vote. It was FDR did best, I think, against Landon in 1936. I think he won with something ridiculously high, like 62% of the vote or something. 62% of 60% of eligible voters, let's say. So he got 3/5 of 62%. Well, 1/5 of 60% is 12. So minus 24, 62, 52, 42. Yeah, so he got like 38% of all of the eligible voters to vote for him, which is pretty good. It's a high watermark that nobody is going to be able to beat in an age of voter apathy. Now, Johnson got results that were somewhere in the league of 35% of all eligible voters. So I was mistaken when I said that Lincoln did the best. Lincoln got like 32% of all eligible voters. Nixon, again, voting was way down, but he got about 50% of 62% of all of the votes. So he didn't do too badly. He got about 31% of the vote, which was slightly worse than Lincoln. So I guess when you look at it that way, the biggest vote getters in American history were more or less in order. FDR, Lyndon Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, and Richard Nixon. Two of the greatest and two of the worst presidents got the most votes. It just goes to show. And so anyway, where was I? In the presidential election, said The Economist, the two candidates have spent so much time wearing each other's clothes. The Economist refers to Bill Clinton as a Democratic Nixon. And they make the very interesting observation that in the late 1960s, the Democrats chose to be the exciting party rather than the majority party, which is very amusing. It is the crowning irony of this campaign that the garrulous president has promised only small things, leaving people to guess what he would do in his second term. Meanwhile, the taciturn challenger has thrown out a promiscuous list of half-explained proposals. Now, here we go. Some interesting sidelights. From 1968 to 1972, Bob Dole had an affair, but of course nobody brought it up. It wasn't considered newsworthy. It would have been newsworthy if there had been hard proof that Clinton had had such an affair that he had not hitherto disclosed. Anyway, so Bob Dole had an affair. I mean, that kind of makes you more likely to vote for him. I mean, you thought he was this humorless, machine-like politician who never had time for a wink, a nudge, a kiss, a sly dig in the ribs. But apparently, he was hail fellow well met. He was good time Charlie. So, both William Blythe Jefferson Clinton III and Bob Dole can trace their ancestry to King Henry III. However, Bill Clinton's descent is illegitimate. So, The Economist has somebody named Lexington who gives the rules for winning an election, which in retrospect is pretty easy to write, but he says, well, first of all, play easy to get. Don't be mysterious, reticent, enigmatic, busy with other things. Be understandable, accessible, willing, solicitous, relentless. Impenetrable dole speak is against the rules. And so then he says, spend, spend, spend. Always return phone calls. Utilize pre-buttal, which is rebutting your opponent's point before he's even had a chance to make it. Have a plan and stick to it. Flattery will get you everywhere. If you lie, lie well. Demonize your rival while remaining saintly yourself. Think image, not just words. Make yourself desirable. Don't blink too much. Know why you're running and why it's good for the country. And finally, discipline is the rule, according to Lexington, for winning the presidential campaign. All this focus on presidential politics, I hope down the road to talk a little bit more about more local types of politics. But the presidency is, in fact, a pretty ripe field. Even if this, even if this was one of the most boring presidential elections in recent years. Well, who do you suppose Gore is going to run against in the year 2000? Liddy Dole is one speculation, according to the November 18th issue of Time. Mel Gibson said on voting, it's like deciding whether you want to be kicked or gouged. I think I'd rather be kicked, actually, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I can get over a kick, bruises heal, but gouging, there's the chance of infection. But then again, bruises, you know, you might break your bones. It's a difficult decision to make. I would tell, Jay Leno said, I would tell Bill Clinton to avoid any sort of prison reform. It could be a potential conflict of interest. Well, in any event, sorry, I'm still not quite awake. You know, I do my best work when I'm not quite awake. Margaret Carlson, who writes for Time, and I suggest you look her stuff up, she's actually very good. referred to Bob Dole as whatever man. You know, whatever has become like the mantra of the 90s. Finally, a distinguishable characteristic of the 90s, the word whatever. Now, where can we trace this? I mean, where does this come from exactly? What was the mantra of the 60s? Be here now. What was the mantra of the 70s? Beer! Now! What was the mantra of the 80s? I don't think the 80s had a mantra, unless it was mantra. Copyright mantra productions. But whatever is the mantra of the 90s. And why is this, you ask? And I reply, whatever, 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 woof, 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 arf, 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 woof, 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 oof, oof, ruf, ruf, rubber, rubber, whatever, 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 whatever. It could be a part of the gay subculture that whatever has, like so many good things, that whatever has entered into the, I guess the mantra for the 80s was, you gotta fight for your right to party, right? So it went from be here now to beer now to party to whatever. Kind of a long, slippery slope, hey? And, so, I mean, it all started with the 50s, right? There is no trend now currently in fashion that could be traced to before the 1950s. It all started in the 1950s, that repository of trivia and the era of good feeling. Although the groundwork for the 50s was laid in the post-war period of 1946 to 1952, or 51, or wherever it was we got involved in Korea. I mean, we had one devastating, traumatic war followed by another a little less than 6 years later. So, you know, 2 wars and a Great Depression, and it was time to party out. Although, I don't think they had a mindless slogan in the 1950s that expressed this particular mindset. The 1950s were, I suppose, a more innocent era insofar as a phrase such as whatever would not have really made much of an impression. But anyway, Bob Dole certainly picked it up as his own. He was not at all shy about bringing that phrase to life. Do you think a movie like Schindler's List could have been made in the 1950s? I don't think so. It's only in the post-ironic, seen it all, been there, done that era of the 1990s. The blasé, blah. Actually, I suppose that whatever could, the closest analog to whatever can be traced back to roughly the early 1940s with Bugs Bunny's, what's up, Doc? Yes, you have to be very careful of that rabbit whose cry is, what's up, Doc? Strange, uncanny things happen when that rabbit appears. Extraordinary, damaging things happen when that rabbit wanders near, that wascally wabbit. Bob Dole, according to the political hotline of October 30th, 1996, said, Bill Clinton said that if he had Dole's record, he'd be running for a rock to hide behind. Wow. And this was cited by Senator John Glenn, Democrat of Ohio. You know what? I just noticed something. Senator John Glenn looks an awful lot like Homer Simpson, and if you list his political affiliation, it's D-OH. In other words, Senator John Glenn. Doe! So anyway, and of course you know the connection between those mysterious cultists, the Applewhites, you know, the cult, that cult in California that committed mass suicide, and now more people are committing suicide in the wake of it. Heaven's Gate. So you know they have a connection to the Simpsons. Doe! Anyway, according to Jesus, Grady, Philadelphia Daily News. Clinton is one of the century's best at campaigning. Nobody works the streets better. Nobody is smoother in a town hall. Nobody is more inexhaustible or more resilient when in a jam. He thrives on the music of the crowds. Even the hecklers juice him up. Now I'd like to say a word about that. This is obviously somebody who hasn't worked a large stage. The thing is, yeah, hecklers can work you up all right, or juice you up as the case may be, but that is so seldom the case. And if Bill Clinton is one of those people who can work with hecklers in that way and allow them to give him an adrenaline surge, then he is the rare campaigner indeed who actually encourages hecklers, like George Wallace once did. Give them hell, Harry. I'm going to give the opponents the truth and it'll feel like hell. Yeah. It's always good to have a snappy riposte ready. That's a lot of what that type of humor is. You can never imagine someone like Hubert Humphrey responding to a heckler with some sort of snappy comeback. Anyway, here's a famous story. George McGovern was confronting a heckler in the 1972 election. And he was speaking at ground level at an airport through a chain link fence. And some guy was heckling him. So he says, "Hey buddy, come here." The guy comes over. George McGovern sort of half whispers into his ear, "Kiss my ass." Now, it's amazing how far we've come. That in 1972, a story like that, if it had broken in the national press prior to the election, would have been considered scandalous. That George McGovern actually said the word ass, and even worse, encouraged a heckler to kiss his ass. You know, in some parts of the country, that's considered a sexual perversion. Richard Wright talks at length of what happened to him when he suggested that his grandmother kiss his ass. Anyway, sorry, I just can't stop eating these Wheatables. These delicious. I'm Rosie O'Donnell. I rudely break off my monologue to talk about the delicious snacks that I'm compulsively munching on. And now, a word for my busy schedule. I started this at around, 11:15. I've got till like 1:15 to finish this, and then I got to drop the dog back at my girlfriend's parents' house, rush to the supermarket, race back here, put the food away. By that time it'll be 2 o'clock. I'll be due at work at 2:30. By the time I get in the shower, it'll be like 2:10. I'll take a 5-minute shower. I better shave first, yeah. So if you hear a buzzing sound, that'll be me shaving because I won't have time to do it otherwise. My schedule is like planned right down to the minute. And you're saying to yourself, well, you lazy sod, if you slept for half an hour less, or, well, you infamous glutton, if you ate for less than 20 minutes, if you ate fewer than 3 eggs, then maybe you would have more time to do this sort of thing. But, well, it's just the way the day shapes up. Being an intellectual worker, I need lots of sleep and lots of food, which means continually going to the market, not to buy milk and eggs, just to buy cabbage and potatoes. See what I'm getting at here? See, my girlfriend wants to have a little Mother's Day thing at her mother's house. At least her mother wants to have a Mother's Day dinner type deal. And we're thinking coleslaw and potato salad. Wow. So that's going to mean lots of mayonnaise, lots of cabbage, lots of potatoes, lots of onions. Sorry about all that dead air. I had to go get myself some more coffee. Anyway, I had a really great recipe for coleslaw. But I have to look at the jar of mayonnaise first. Now I know what you're thinking. Mayonnaise? How vulgar. But let's face it. What you're talking here, when you're talking coleslaw, is cabbage and onions. Now, what kind of crazy son of a bitch would eat raw cabbage and onions without something to render it palatable? I didn't even like coleslaw until I was about 15 years old. I mean, I hated it. It didn't taste like anything to me. But now my body craves these essential nutrients. Unfortunately, we're running low on milk. What I like to do when I go to the market is just buy the bare minimum of stuff and then use the triple coupons to get all the goodies. But we're running so low on milk that might be problematic. Although, I suppose I could hold out until tomorrow. Buy the cabbage today and the milk tomorrow. It would make more sense, though, to buy the milk today and the cabbage tomorrow. Oh yeah, I was going to show you the mayonnaise bottle, but I can't show you because the camera's not working that well. You really want to get the Hellmann's, okay? I don't want to sound like I'm like a partisan or anything, but the Hellmann's mayonnaise is like the best mayonnaise, I think. Cane's is all right, but it's I don't know. It's better for potato salad than it is for coleslaw. Let's put it that way. And I got a potato salad recipe here, but I'll tell you my recipe for coleslaw and potato salad. Well, for coleslaw, this is a Craig Claiborne recipe stripped down to its bare essentials. You get 1 head of cabbage, 1 regular onion, or 2 Vidalia onions, depending on your tastes, and 3/4 of a jar of 16-ounce jar of mayonnaise, about 3/4 of a pint, about 12 fluid ounces of mayonnaise, or let's see, that would be 0.35 liters, 1/3 of a liter. Now that's an awful lot of calories there. Let's see, 3/4 of a jar. There's 3,200 calories in the entire jar. So there's 3/4 of that would be 20, 800, 2,400 calories. But the cabbage has what, like maybe, I don't know, 200 calories tops, and the onions ditto. So what we're talking about here is a gigantic bowl of coleslaw that in its entirety has 3,000 calories. But even at the, even assuming that you have incredibly hungry guests, um, it's easily enough to serve 8 people. So each serving has somewhat less in the way of calories. I don't know, maybe each serving has about 400, 350 calories or something. But it's so good for you. Maybe I'll use less mayonnaise. Anyway, their recipe for potato salad. I forgot the most important thing about the coleslaw. You got to put in 1 or 2 tablespoons of caraway seeds. That's it. Cabbage, onions, mayonnaise, caraway seeds. And you got to shred the cabbage in a food processor. I mean, you can cut it by hand if you like, but that is incredibly time consuming. Also, you want to like chop the onions. You don't want to shred them in the food processor. You want to chop them in like a blender type deal, because otherwise, unless you really like onions, there's big chunks of onions that way if you don't do it, if you shred them instead. Their potato salad recipe: 1 cup Hellmann's real mayonnaise, 2 tablespoons vinegar, 1½ teaspoon salt, 1 teaspoon sugar, an abomination, 1/4 cup teaspoon pepper, 4 cups cubed potatoes, 5 to 6 medium, 1 cup sliced celery, 1/2 cup chopped onion, 2 hard cooked eggs chopped. Well, I don't know about the eggs, but that wouldn't be my recipe for potato salad. My recipe is pretty plain and simple. 2 small or 1 large onion, preferably a Vidalia onion if you like your stuff a little sweet. I don't know. I always make massive amounts of potato salad when I make it. So I would plop in about maybe 12 potatoes. I would use perhaps a 16-ounce jar of mayonnaise. Now here's the trick. I don't know what they tell you about the methodology of this. I have a feeling that it's, do they tell you to peel the potatoes first? No, they don't. Well, there's 2 ways to do this. If you're making mashed potatoes, you want to always peel the potatoes before you boil them. Because if you leave the skins on, well, they're harder to mash. Let's put it that way. When you're making potato salad, on the other hand, you want to leave the skins on before you boil them. And you got to wash, you got to scrub the potato skins thoroughly. You don't want dirt floating up in your water, because it tends to contaminate the potatoes if and when they burst open due to the boiling action. Now, you got to keep in mind it's going to take you at least an hour to cook that many potatoes. You got to plan on it being an hour long. And, I mean, you got to make this about 3 hours in advance of when it's going to be eaten at a minimum. Because once it's come out of the, once you've prepared everything, mixed all the ingredients, and basically it's very simple. 12 potatoes, 2 onions, 1 jar, 16-ounce mayonnaise, and try to use Hellmann's mayonnaise. You can use Cane's in a pinch. I suppose if you wanted to be fancy, you could use curry powder and yogurt instead of mayonnaise. But in that case, I think you would probably want to serve the dish warm rather than cold. And you want to make sure your curry powder is really fresh. You got to use enough salt to taste, I mean, what's the point of indulging yourself in this type of thing if you're not going to use enough salt? A little bit of pepper. Not everybody likes pepper. And you're not going to be eating this all by yourself. I mean, there's going to be other people involved in the process of eating this. Finally, well, I mean, you can use there's a lot of things you can put in this dish, but it's best when it's really simple. The advantage to using Cane's mayonnaise for potato salad instead of Hellmann's is it tends to blend a little easier. It's kind of air fluffed, so it's less heavy, but it doesn't taste quite as good. Now, there are ways to circumvent mayonnaise altogether. I mean, it's a different dish, right? Now, for the coleslaw, you can just buy Savoy cabbage. Use a little bit of oil and vinegar and a little bit of onion. Make it delicate, lighter version of the same dish. I mean, you don't have to go all hog wild on the oil and stuff. I mean, just, some nice olive oil. Olive oil is very good for you. You won't go too far wrong eating olive oil. And then of course, you have to think of better seasonings, like maybe a little salt, a little pepper. Well, what's good for this sort of thing? I wouldn't recommend substituting this all the time for the actual ingredients, but flavored salts such as celery salt, garlic salt, onion salt, they can be pretty good. Or you can use salt with celery powder or celery seed, or salt with onion powder, or salt with garlic powder. Now, one thing I don't really approve of is those. Um, they're sort of like bottled garlic, pickled in water. Those never taste quite right to me, and they tend to go kind of quickly. I mean, if you don't have the time to actually get a fresh head of garlic and chop it up yourself, maybe you're better off just using garlic powder or even garlic salt, which is even quicker. So anyway, back to politics. And now, you may think that this was an enormous digression, that, what does coleslaw and potato salad have to do with politics? Bite your tongue, my friend. They have everything to do with politics. When you're having one of those little political events out in the veteran of foreign wars back parking lot or wherever it is you have it, I mean, you got to lay on the grub. And what could be cheaper and more delicious than plenty of coleslaw and potato salad to go along with those hot dogs and hot dog buns? And of course, here in Rhode Island, it's also clam chowder and clam cakes and the like. But I went to a political event in the summer of 1996. It was quite strange. It was for a Rhode Island State House candidate named Betsy Denigan, and she had all these green stickers that I gave to every single person in the hall, even the young children. And many of them were already wearing many stickers. There are very few people in that hall that I did not give a sticker to, and it wasn't for lack of trying. One of them hated the color green. Another was a babbling eccentric who insisted that the candidate had snubbed him. By stroking his ego for about 5 minutes, I managed to convince him that although he wasn't a man to make mistakes, he was probably likely mistaken, and that he was merely misinterpreting her, and that sometimes she gives off these signals like she's ignoring you, but she's not really. And by all means, she considers you the vanguard of her campaign. Of all people, you're the one that she'd be least likely to treat in that fashion. And I'm sure that you must have, there must be like, not that your perceptions are in any way limited by your mental illness, but no, she couldn't have done that. That's not her. I know her. I've worked with her. She's been my colleague, and no, that's not her. So, I'm actually pretty good at this political schmoozing shit, if I really want to be. I gave a sticker to everybody in the hall. That was my job. And I barely even had enough time to eat before we had to leave, because we didn't want to stick around for all the speeches. We were just there to do the groundwork. It was very interesting and instructive, and I was so impressive that some of the other local political major domos said, "Who is that young man? I like the cut of his jib." And so there it is, a career in politics for me. But I'm fascinated by politics, and I know what it takes to be successful in politics. It's just that I don't feel like being a lawyer, and I don't particularly care to run, at this time, for elective office. Maybe down the road, I'll run for State House in a safe district. And you should have seen Denigan's opponent in this race. He was a sportscaster who had been convicted of beating his wife or something like that, running against a woman who was both a doctor and a lawyer and married to a doctor, and who lived in her district for 20 years, compared to some guy who had just shown up in the district was from Texas, was given to using colorful Texas expressions that a lot of the women didn't really appreciate. He got real upset when um, his his opponent Denigan enjoined him from doing sportscasts while the race was in progress, and they neither of them were the incumbents, so it was kind of an interesting race. But she beat him by a pretty humiliating margin. I mean, it wasn't 80-40; it was more like 66-34, but that's pretty humiliating because he was a real loose cannon, and she was like the ultimate schmoozer, like the ultimate get along, go along type of person. Well, anyway, talking about somewhat less localized politics, but more local. Um, Someone named Egan in the Boston Herald is quoted in the hotline of October 30th as talking about the Weld-Kerry race, which we all know the result of. Of course, now Weld whips John Kerry's ass, only to go to Mexico. I'm going to Disneyland. We've heard it all a million times now. Weld says crime bad, welfare bad, taxes very bad. Kerry says Bill Weld wants to steal mother's milk from the mouths of babes and give it to bloated billionaires. Well, that was an interesting sidebar. The hotline of October 31st. You shouldn't be too upset about that, you know what Mark Twain said about that. He said, every dog needs a few fleas. Bill Clinton on hecklers. If John Kerry is a veterans advocate, I'm a Chinese aviator, says Ross Perot, coming out to endorse Bill Weld. The hotline of November 4th. Political hotline is put out on a daily basis. Generally, it's available online, although you can also have a print copy produced for your benefit. The Kennedy School of Government at Harvard tends to get it just before the election, and then they don't get it anymore because it's very, very expensive. Clinton, as always, has held his own vision, has held his own when it comes to courting exhaustion in search of votes. So Bob Dole's little feat of staying up for 48 hours wasn't really perhaps the right strategy to use against an opponent who is much more easily able to do the exact same thing. It's as if Haley Barbour, who of course is a big Republican honcho, was talking about Bill Clinton's campaign finance speech. And Haley Barbour is quoted as saying, it's as if Nixon had said, the answer to Watergate is we should get higher quality tape recorders. Yeah, this whole campaign finance thing, and now of course, recently it has come out that the Republicans too were taking money from Chinese lobbyists. But of course in this instance, it wasn't mainland China, it was Hong Kong, but still, Chinese is Chinese. And the press is never reluctant to draw these simplistic conclusions when it suits their purpose because they think the American public is composed primarily of idiots who wouldn't holler suey if the hogs were eating them, who are bored stiff with politics, who are only riveted by scandals involving major personalities or what I'll call media-designated personalities, people who by themselves don't really have much cachet, but when the light of media scrutiny is shed upon them, suddenly become important people, players, as it were. That Simpson fellow, not O.J., of course, but the other guy, the guy who was convicted on 42 counts of rape and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Well, I'm not going to put my oars in the water concerning the verdict that was handed down to him. I'm not speaking from the point of view of a man or of a military partisan, because I am neither. Um, I am, of course, an alien who despises your American military because it prevents me from taking over your puny planet. But don't you think 25 years is a bit harsh? It was consensual sex, after all. Sure, there's no such thing as consensual sex when it comes to a drill sergeant. But why do you think they call them drill sergeants? Anyway, the press sort of distorted this whole thing, saying that the reason he was convicted on charges of rape is that whenever a drill sergeant has sex with his subordinates, it is rape because of the enormous power he wields over them, etc., 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 blah, 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 do say do, la-di-da. But that's not true. That's not the law. The Army just said it was the law. Now, whether they're trying to railroad this guy because he's black, well, maybe. I don't think that should be the sole reason he should be let off the hook, however, even if they are trying to railroad him, which they probably are. We're going to make an example of you, young man. The Army's just like elementary school. Except all of the threats they make in elementary school turn out to be true in the Army. Like, this is going to go on your permanent record. Well, actually, it is going on your permanent record if you're in the Army. And we're going to make an example of you. And, in fact, we are going to make an example of you. Go directly to the principal's office. Go directly to the brig, you know. So, I don't know if this is like a stunning insight or not. And the same people who are hall monitors in elementary school go on to like volunteer for military service later in life. So there are parallels. And gym coach, drill sergeant. That's the other parallel. What if your gym coach had raped you, you know? Anyway, Jay Leno was talking about Bob Dole. Bob Dole is saying that he's treating this campaign as if he's fighting a war. I don't think that's very smart. It's not a war. It's not anything like a war, for one thing. Bill Clinton is in it. Dun, 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 dun. So, what about that crack Contra CIA story? The New York Times goes out of its way to discredit this story. This story can shatter a republic. I think it's so damaging, the implications are so extraordinary, that for us to run this story, it had better be based on the most solid evidence we can amass. This sounds an awful lot like what a prosecutor would say concerning a person who committed a particularly disreputable crime. It's like, this crime is so heinous, this perpetrator is so loathsome, this act and deed is so monstrous, that before we take this case to court, we had better have some solid evidence. Every police procedural in the country on television, you know, I mean, it's like, but, you know, of course they wouldn't say that if it weren't so. When people talk about the nuts and bolts and mechanics of power, that then they tend to be telling the truth. That's the one thing they know about. And if they're even willing to talk about it at all, they have no real motivation to lie. Now, do they? Jim I can't pronounce this guy's name. Jim Naurekis, also in the, there's a magazine called Extra put out by Fairness in Media, and they put out a newsletter. Well, it's a magazine, but they put out a newsletter called Extra Update. And in this magazine from October of '96, Jim Naurekis says, instead of providing citizens with information about candidates' policy proposals, journalists now tell voters about their own instant responses to slogans on a mindless 1 to 10 scale. Is this an indirect dig at U.S. News and World Report, who has started its Scando-meter? You know, if you guys haven't been reading U.S. News and World Report lately, you probably should. They've really been shaking it up over there, and it's actually pretty interesting to read. I think in some respects it is superior to Time, although in many respects it is, to that degree, somewhat a Newsweek wannabe. Now here's the thing. I have a hierarchy of in what order I read things. If you read all three of the news weeklies every week, you got to sort of put them in some sort of order. Unfortunately, I sort of have to read them as they become available. Newsweek is always late at Providence College and at the Kennedy School. U.S. News and World Report is always there no later than Tuesday or Wednesday at the very latest. And Time magazine is sometimes it's early, sometimes it's there on Tuesday, and sometimes it's not there until Thursday. But generally it's not very late. But Newsweek, people tend to hang on to Newsweek. So if I had my way, if I had all three of them in front of me and I hadn't read any of them, I would read them in this order: Newsweek, Time, U.S. News and World Report. But since I can't read them in that order, I have to read them in U.S. News and World Report, Time, Newsweek. I got to read them in reverse order. And if you've read the same story 3 times, I mean 2 times already, you're going to tend to want to skim it the 3rd time if you read it at all. Because, I mean, but it's interesting to see what kind of spin each of these puts on a particular story. Newsweek tends to like snap, crackle, and pop with worthwhile aphorisms. Time gives you this sort of lengthy, dutiful, protocol-obsessed account of the same thing, and they tend to skimp a little bit on the arts coverage when compared to Newsweek. And U.S. News and World Report will sidebar things that it doesn't consider to be major stories and devote extraordinary amounts of space to their cover story, which increasingly has less become the personality of the week and more the long-term trend that they see as being influential in years to come. So in any event, the 3 news weeklies are all well worth looking at, which is not something you could have said even as recently as 5 years ago. I would say you could safely skip U.S. News and World Report, skim Time, and read Newsweek. Now I would say, well, skim them all, but read certain parts of Newsweek very carefully, like the conventional wisdom watch. Certain parts of Time should be read very carefully. Basically, they're very good with foreign coverage, foreign policy coverage. But you know, there's also some magazines that are published on a monthly basis, which are very good with foreign coverage as well. World Press Review, for example. And there are some weeklies that I would rather turn to, like The Economist or The Spectator, if I wanted to get world news, particularly The Economist. It is a fundamental rule of politics, says an aide to the former governor of Maryland, William Don Schaefer. It is a fundamental rule of politics. You don't crawl in bed with people you don't know. The first 2 questions you ask when someone offers you political money are, who are they and what do they want? Bob McDevitt, and here I'm quoting from a news journal, it's like a newsletter called Capital I, and it's pretty good. You know, there's a whole bunch of like newsletter type deals that come out on politics, and of all of them that I have examined, the First Amendment Rights newsletter and Capital I are some of the best, with some of the more useful and quotable information. The candidate should spend 4 to 5 hours, 6 days a week fundraising. Remember, bumper stickers and signs are fun, but it is money that wins elections. A solid fundraising system makes the difference between being a candidate and being a winner. Micah S. Green is quoted as saying, when you sponsor events, you want them to have a nexus to the industry you represent. Well, duh, but still. Now I would like to quote from a friend of mine who was cited in the National Journal of the 19th of October. Now, National Journal, quite frankly, admittedly, is one of the things that I skip. I read probably about 40 to 50 magazines a month. 40 to 50 different magazines a month, and some of them are published weekly. So I just don't have the time to read everything. So I tend to give National Journal a go-by. But not this time I didn't, because they were quoting from a friend of mine from high school named Phil English, who is now, of course, a congressman in Pennsylvania. He's kind of a liberal Republican, a vanishing breed. He was the first Republican to support the minimum wage bill. Having an issue as big and popular as welfare rebuts the notion that I'm outside the mainstream. My opponent looks like he's extreme, parked out on the liberal left, says Phil English. Now, in a survey of political cartoonists, 30% of them were said to be hard left, such as Herblock and Tolles from the Buffalo newspaper. 40% are centrist left, such as Cal, Harvard class of 77. 20% are central rightists, such as Jeff McNeely, shoe pluggers. 10% are hard right, Mike Ramirez, Memphis Commercial Appeal. So 30% are hard left, 30% are centrist right and hard right, and 40% are centrist left among political cartoonists. Something that's good to keep in mind. This presentation is beginning to disintegrate under the combined pressures of time constraints and my ability to sustain a coherent, logical, sequential, and connected narrative for a time period of 2 hours in length. Nevertheless, maybe I should take a brief break. I'll continue screaming to the camera from the kitchen because I don't want to waste a single minute. Because you see, time is very short. Yeah, you're going home soon. I'm talking to the dog, not you, America. So, let's get back to business here. In the end, the presidential election is about performance. Character and ideology are secondary in the minds of the voters, says William Schneider. Well, anyway, now we're getting to the U.S. News and World Report post-mortem issue of November 18th. Morally, says Alex Castellanos on Bill Clinton, morally, I don't think he's fit to make Bob Dole's license plate, though he may soon be doing so, he says rather ominously. You see how I've internalized all this stuff, and months later I can come back to it and refer to it in a sort of abstract form, even before I've reviewed it, which is rather odd. It's always better to let the subconscious do this type of work. You know what I'm saying? I mean, the conscious mind, it's good. You know, you give it a living wage and stuff. It's the subconscious that you should be giving the bonuses to. Like, employ them part-time as a consultant and give them, give them $50 an hour wage to figure out the answer to your problems. Whereas the conscious mind, it's good. It's a good 9 to 5 Joe. Punch in, punch out, 16, 13 an hour type thing. But the subconscious mind deserves the big money. Big money. Big money, as they like to say, not only on Wheel of Fortune, but during presentations of the lottery. So, anyway, I'm making a note of this. Conscious mind, $16.12 an hour. Subconscious mind, consultant, $50 plus an hour. See, I mean, if I were really attuned to this sort of wage structure, I would say $500 an hour or $1.1 million a year in bonuses and fringe benefits. But, well, as Reckless Eric has been known to say in his song, take the cash. Take the cash. Don't let them pay you in kind. Take the cash before they change their mind. And let's see the color of their money. Take the cash, which is a very charming song. The press is not so much ideologically biased, says Ken Auletta in the New Yorker. The press is not so much ideologically biased as simply in favor of conflict. Yes. And speaking of the subconscious mind, Terence Rafferty says, surrealist works, like the dreams they imitate, derive their unsettling power from the lucidity with which they portray impossible, irrational events. The more clearly we see, the stranger things look, and the more fully we surrender to what can't be understood. Sort of like our political system. Anyway. So, and thank God I take a break from politics for a while. I can see here. And Ross Perot blamed his defeat on being born with a head that looks exactly like a turnip, said Bruce McCall in the post-mortem issue of the election post-mortem issue of the New Yorker, dated November 18th. These people have to make their they gotta put their journals together like at least a week in advance. They can insert breaking news, but unfortunately the election is mandated for Tuesday, and most weekly publications come out on Monday, except of course The Economist, which I think, I'm not sure now, but I think it comes out on a Saturday. I've seen it on a Saturday. I've seen it on a Friday. I think it comes out the Friday before. Which, and the Republic of Texas, I mean, isn't it convenient they surrendered on a Sunday, just in time to make the newspapers on Sunday and or a Saturday, whenever it was. They surrendered just in time to make the Sunday papers and the issues of Time and Newsweek. So there's a notable bias for events which take place on Friday as opposed to events which take place on Monday, when they'll be 7 days old by the time the weekly journals get a hold of it in the news cycle, and nearly a week old by the time the Sunday papers get to them, if they get to them at all, which generally they do not. It's too bad that most Sunday papers don't seem to have some sort of supplemental weekly, news weekly thing where you can catch up on the week's news if you're too busy to follow it from day to day. I think newspapers now tend to think of themselves as being merely supplemental to television. Some newspapers actually refer to events in little sidebar columns like the Providence Journal does, which are not really fully explicated anywhere in the paper. So, in other words, they assume that you've been following television news on a daily basis, and what they're offering is their print commentary on events which were covered only by television news and not by the paper, except on an ongoing basis, not on that very day, which is kind of sad, actually. I would hate to live in a country where the only source of news was, in fact, television news. Wouldn't you? Well, wouldn't you? Anyway, elections produce, it says in the New Statesman and Society of November 1st, elections produce a kind of emotional disorder or election fever as strategists play on the population's anxieties. Hooey! I've got election fever! Ultimately, says Howard Zinn, cited by Alexander Cockburn, ultimately, if change comes to America, it won't come through the voting booth. Change will come through tumultuous movements around the country, movements that are so strong that whatever party is holding power has to respond. The future will be determined by whether citizens organize and mobilize and create a commotion. Well, you know what? I was just thinking about this. What if the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 1960s were, at some point, not too far down the line, to take place in the United States? Now, there would be the basis of a novel. I guess I'd call it something like 2K-365. Yeah, that's a good title for a novel. Bunch of letters and numbers. Anyway, it was said that when we were in an adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union, that the two countries would become more and more alike, which in fact has become the case. We became more authoritarian in response to the threat of authoritarianism presented at that time by the Soviet Union. And now the Soviet Union is becoming more capitalist as a result of the threat presented by the United States and its massive arms buildup. The only way the Soviets could remain competitive was basically to fold their hand and sort of cash in their chips and take their winnings and go home, or swallow their losses and head out the door. But anyway, now that our enemy apparently is rapidly shaping up to be China, perhaps we will become more like them, even as they are in the process of becoming more like us. As a matter of fact, the spoiling their environment and taking on all of the greatest excesses of late 19th century capitalism, those are both pretty good ways of behaving more like us. So maybe we'll become more like them and have our own little cultural revolution in which university professors are forced to confess their sins in front of villages cram-packed with peasants. Wouldn't that be nice, huh? Overthrow all the media hotshots and bigwigs and double domes, make them wear big dunce hats with ludicrous hieroglyphic characters scrawled on them, and force them to confess their sins over the very media which they utilize to exploit the working classes and other people for so long. Wouldn't that be fun? Well, it would be for a while, but before too long, you yourself, an educated person, would also be the victim. So, as much as you would like to see this happen, don't let it happen. Well, truly idealistic souls in politics rarely make it to the primaries, much less the White House, says Gary Christ. in the New York Times Book Review of October 27th. However, in the New York Times Book Review of November 3rd, there's quite a bit of stuff about Nelson Rockefeller, who, as we recall, was Gerald Ford's vice president for the 2 years and 3 months of his term. When superiors were put off by the nakedness of his ambition, Nelson Rockefeller would seek to mollify them with a combination of flattery and self-abnegation. Nelson's philosophy was, well, let's start, and 9 times out of 10 you'll find a way. Like Roosevelt, Rockefeller, with his confident grin and regal air, made politics look effortless and victory inevitable. Almost by definition, a good memoir is self-revelatory. Almost by definition, a good politician is not. So, if a good politician cannot write a good memoir, then what exactly does he write? An extended version of a bio ad, a life story in which the protagonist is rarely, if ever, wrong, and which the truly irredeemable errors are passed over or passed on to someone else. So, and again, here's a very good idea for a novel. The candidate's biography acted out on stage and opposed to what really happened. It's been done before, of course, but it could be very entertaining. Or even better, the candidate's eulogy acted out on stage as opposed to what really happened. In other words, we see a preacher preaching over the body of a dead man, eulogizing him by selectively distorting certain distasteful aspects of his life, and we see in a sidebar to the side of the stage, as a sort of interruptus, the actual candidate, his or herself, acting out what really happened in the course of that eulogy. Yes, I think I finally got the plot to my third play. Thank you very much. This has been most therapeutic for me, talking all this stuff out. Yes, yeah. So, well, we still got a little while left to go. I don't think I'm going to make it to the market today. Not unless I get dressed and prepared for it now. So you'll forgive me if I appear to be shouting from you from another room. It's because I am. You know, says my girlfriend, I don't ask all that much from you. All I ask is that you wash the bedding and mop the kitchen floor and vacuum every rug in the house and clean everything out of your room and open all the windows and crack open all of the shades so that my plants can get some light. And while you're at it, why don't you water the plants and clean off the living room table, but don't throw anything away because it might be something I want to keep. And clean off the kitchen table, but don't throw away any of the mail because some of it's bills that you have to pay, but I haven't given them to you yet. And I hate to say it, but when she cries, her face gets all red and it's very appealing. I mean, not in a sexual way, mind, but I don't know, I mean, she looks prettier her face is flushed. But that's neither here nor there. Of course, I hope you don't think that I'm suggesting that I deliberately set out to make her cry so that I can produce this effect. No, I no longer fiendishly experiment on human subjects like I used to when I was an adolescent. A common adolescent urge, if I mistake me not. Something that someone like local personality Krishna Venkatesh still does, even though he is in his late 20s by now. It's a thoroughly understandable urge to want to experiment on people, but it's just not very nice. See? How many times have I told you? People don't enjoy being made fools of. Can't you get it through your thick and greasy head? Now what's this? Why am I even saving half this stuff? A receipt from Bo Ricks, which, for a haircut? It must have some important information written on it. Story about school system in West Warwick. Daniel Burns, front page of Metro section. West Warwick edition of Providence Journal. Okay. It's a relative of my girlfriend's mother. Now, I couldn't get the West Bay edition of the Providence Journal because that would mean going to West Warwick to get it. But since now it's January 29th, paradoxically enough, I can now get the microfilm version of the same journal and make a photocopy of it. And so that'll work out that way, which is good. I don't know. I might have to forget about going to the market. I mean, this is not proceeding along as quickly as I had hoped it would. Well, I don't know. I could just barely do it. But, you know, I just don't have the time to do everything that I wanted to do today. And, well, now we're getting to the point where we have to wind down our presentation. And in order to do that, I suppose I ought to, sum up a little bit and say that, first of all, cite my source, which is the New York Times Book Review. Every politician's career turns out, like a medieval saint's life, to be built from essentially the same allegorical kit. The candidate to be is sired invariably by strict but loving parents who teach him the value of hard work and family. His career illustrates the enduring principles of the American dream. He is grateful for his success and wants to return something to his country. Lamar Alexander, when he lost his primary bid for the Republican Party, made the following confession, which of course is very indicative of Lamar Alexander. I drove off and stopped at a Texaco station, bought a Dr. Pepper, filled it with salted peanuts, and drank it, just the way I did when I was a boy. It didn't make any sense. I just wanted to do it. Well, here's an interesting sidebar about Bob Dole. Mr. Dole was apparently so out of it that in the early 1970s, he could write to the British Embassy asking officials to arrange a performance by the Beatles at his daughter Robin's high school. And he's still so out of it, apparently, that he views the anecdote as amusing rather than devastating. Politicians seem to imagine the printed memoir as just another safer way to reach voters. Mark Twain wrote to William Dean Howells that an autobiography is the truest of books. For while it inevitably consists mainly of extinctions of the truth, sharkings of the truth, partial revealments of the truth, with hardly an instance of plain, straight truth, the remorseless truth is there between the lines. Now, Cato Byrne in the National Review said, "A man who is clinging to power can achieve nothing impressive. The public sees everything he does as an attempt to survive." Matt Scully refers to Gorbachev as the Cold War's man who shot Liberty Valance, hailed in the West for an achievement not really his, while the man they should be honoring quietly recedes from view. He is, of course, speaking of Ronald Reagan, the John Wayne figure in this scenario. Well, Ross Perot says to his supporters after the election, "Take a little break and then we'll climb back in the ring and keep the pressure on." It is reported that, now what happened to all the candidates in this colorful little story? Well, Al Gore reverts to enviro-geekdom in victory speech, says the conventional wisdom. Toe-sucking ex-Clinton strategist Dick Morris, reportedly booted by spouse. Worse, fails to land network pundit spot. Bill Clinton. "Now we've got a bridge to build and I'm ready if you are," he says in his inaugural. Bill Clinton won, says Howard Feynman, by emphasizing what he opposed, cuts, rather than what he was for, targeted tax breaks. "Something may indeed have been lost in this election," says Howard Feynman. "The concept of president as paragon, the ideal, has been fading since the 1960s, and now a man who came of age in that decade seems to have buried it, at least for now." Americans, it seems, weren't looking for inspiration, but for a county executive writ large. The parties have turned themselves into ideologically vacuous cash sumps, collecting large donations. Gerald Ford, George Bush, Bob Dole, a trio of World War II vets lamenting a lost America. Sophomoric California. No, sophomore in Colorado, where ski bums compete with Christian activists. Oh, how sad, how sad. Bill Clinton has always run for office as if he were being chased. He seems most comfortable a stutter step ahead of the posse. The posse is left breathless and frustrated, consigned to marvel at his oleaginous virtuosity. A political Houdini, a series of escape acts his 4 years in office, says Joe Klein. Bill Clinton, the fucking Washington crowd is what he refers to when discussing his fellow compeers in Washington. Dick Morris, a classic mercenary, demonic, brilliant, principle-free. He was mocked at the White House as a crazy person, paranoid and grandiose. He who defines first, finishes first. And I suppose that's about as good a rule of politics as we could possibly come up with. When Clinton lost the election in the 1980s, he sold his soul to the devil, and the devil sent him Dick Morris. Mystery is an integral part of power. Shopping malls, the town squares of 90s America. He's seen things. He knows things about the world, about people. He's seen intelligent reports that have taken him to a different place. There's no one else at that place. And Gingrich had almost succeeded in turning the president into a constitutional monarch with a fancy title, but without much real power. Gingrich's staffers cringed when their boss drifted off into what they called Newt World, the day he demanded all-day psychoanalysis session. I'm the wrong hero. This is all for now. Well, you didn't really think I was going to let you off that easily, did you? No, I guess we still got a little ways to go yet. Too bad, too bad. You know, I really wanted to use this time to do some grocery shopping, but I don't know if I'm going to make it to the market. It's just so hard, a man with my busy schedule. And yet, it was almost as if Bob Dole enjoyed defying his handlers. Bob Dole would mix in campaign ideas with the official campaign themes, whether or not the two jibed. Jack Hilton told Dole he needed to slow his pace. Neither you nor your audience is double part. When told of Bob Dole's abortion smear by phone campaign, the candidate Steve Forbes flushed and began furiously tapping his feet, the way he sometimes signaled his emotions. 3x culture plus 1x economic plus 1x agriculture was the template for the typical Dole speech. You work for Bill Clinton, you go up and down more times than a whore's nightgown, says the salty James Carville. Dole's bio ad. The story. Pity Quest, it was called. Duh. So, I need to slow my pace a little bit. It's almost impossible for the vice president and the president to come from the same state. I don't know why this should be, but it is. We've got quite a bit more political stuff here, much more than I am able to cover today. And unfortunately, it is at the very worst of times. So let me just say this about that. Goodbye. God bless. I guess I'll throw some music on as an outro, and I will leave you to your own devices. And so please tune in next week. Oh, great. Anyway, this has been The Wrong Hero, and the presentation that we have brought to you has been Naked to Mine Enemies. Next week, we're going to continue with our 1996 election post-mortem, and the title of that program will be Negative Capability. In weeks to follow, we'll be talking about the role of campaign finance in politics, in the presentation entitled Hopelessly Corrupt. And in the weeks to follow, we'll also be talking about the role of the press in the presentation entitled Radical Clarity. Beyond that, I don't have any real cut and dried plans, but of course this will be, as ever, The Wrong Hero presenting Cafe Cabaret.